I'm thrilled to be here today with three people whose work is so relevant to the idea of art as a community building tool. This concept is central to Bank of America's support of the arts because we believe the arts are unmatched in doing two things, simultaneously creating both social and economic capital. The arts and the institutions and artists that present them create a sense of community and give us tools to understand our times, ourselves, and each other. I believe the times we are living in have forever changed how we engage with the arts. And as museums and other arts organizations slowly move toward reopening, they too are rethinking what it means to be part of a community, not only geographically, but in the broader sense of bringing people together around commonalities and understanding. The pandemic and societal challenges we are living through have caused great pain, but disruptions are powerful incubators for positive change. I have some very special guests with me today. Los Angeles Mayor Eric Garcetti, Kasimu Harris, artist and visual storyteller in New Orleans, and Mickey Northcutt, founding director of North Shore Community Development Corporation and co-founder of Punto Urban Art Museum in Salem, Massachusetts. All of their biographies are available on the Summit website. I'd like to start with Kasimu and Mickey and ask you each to describe what you've done in New Orleans and Salem to create greater understanding and more connection among people in your communities. You've been doing this work for a while, so what have you done retrospectively, but also more recently in response to the pandemic and the social and racial issues we are experiencing? And maybe we could start with Kasimu.
Well, thank you. Thanks for being a part of this panel, and it's an honor. Well, in New Orleans, it's a lot about telling our stories and helping us to see ourselves. Specifically to state of the art, I've been doing some work on documenting the vanishing black bars and lounges in New Orleans. And I call them vanishing for a reason, because they were prolific and in great abundance, and over time they've changed. So within that, it's just not a bar, it's just not a respite for some drinks and some laughs. Historically, it's been a place that you could go to when the rest of the world wouldn't allow you in. And I'm talking about during Jim Crow or during segregated periods in our country's history. So in New Orleans, these black spaces date back to the 1800s, and you have one on record called Economy Hall that was founded in 1857, and they had a benevolent society there where you could pay in and make sure you had a proper burial, and it was the place that was the catalyst for funerals and second line parades, and all these things start to build out in the community. So we have the brass bands, we have the early stages of the social aid and pleasure clubs. Then you have people fraternizing and communing together. So I'm showing us ourselves, looking at the present and the past, and from where some of the traditions that are still practiced in New Orleans came from. And these are things, when we think about the second lines or the black masculine Indians, it's practiced in New Orleans but enjoyed by people all over. So that's been really important for me. And during this global pandemic, we haven't had a chance to get together. We can't have second lines like we usually do on Sundays, because in New Orleans, you don't only have a second line for a funeral. You have second lines about 40 weeks of the year. Or we don't have the black masculine Indians, which are also known as the Mardi Gras Indians, because obviously we can't come together. So some of my work has started to look in these places that were already fighting for survival, how are they continuing to exist now? And I've gone into a few of the bars that have gone through the various iterations of phase one or phase two, and they could do to go, and now they can't do anything. So they're still struggling for existence. But even within the black community or the larger community, some of these bars were places that people just didn't go. Maybe they were a little reticent, or maybe because it wasn't in their neighborhood. So having my work in a place like the State of the Art, or it was also in the New York Times earlier this year, it just was able to spread that message a lot wider, and I'm thankful for that.
Yes, it's extremely powerful. Thank you. Mickey, do you want to talk to us a little bit about how you've done work over the years to embed art in the community and bring the community together through arts?
Sure. So thank you for having me. I live and work in a neighborhood called The Point in Salem, and The Point is it's a very special neighborhood in Salem, but it's also one whose experience I think a lot of us around the country will relate to. It's a small, dense urban neighborhood that's adjacent to Salem's downtown. Salem's economy is thriving in the sense I would say in normal times with a really strong tourism economy, and The Point was really built up originally as housing for new immigrants and people who are working in factories in Salem when that was in a different generation much more common, and it has remained an immigrant community predominantly, and for the last 50 years it's been very Caribbean, predominantly Dominican. And so I work for a community development nonprofit. Our work over the last 40 years has really been focused on first community organizing, and later we sort of came to affordable housing development, like a lot of community development organizations. And the way that we sort of got here today and why we're working in the arts is we had started to use the arts just as a means of a creative way to get people involved. We've always wanted to be as inclusive as possible, and making sure that the things and investments that go on in this neighborhood are actually like tied to what people want to see in their own neighborhood. And we had to use the arts to get people involved, and saw that it was like highly effective. People just, who answers their door to door knocking anymore, right? And in doing that, we saw the potential for really changing the narrative that was very much rooted in stigma. A lot of that has come from, whether it's racism, classism, xenophobia, all of that comes together to create a really like negative environment when people talk about the Point neighborhood. And we knew that like building more affordable housing isn't really necessarily in itself going to change that stigma. And parents that we heard from constantly felt like, you can't really talk about improving the quality of life in this community if you can't address this like deep and long held stigma. So our experiment with the arts was that if we can use our affordable housing developments as a canvas and a platform for a major public art initiative, that it would essentially use beauty to change the narrative in the neighborhood, and not to change it away from what it truly is, but to realign its public image with what it really is, which is a family-friendly, welcoming community that's been home for generations of immigrants and is a wonderful place. So the typical news stories that we've all seen that talk about a community like this in a negative light, we've seen really great progress in, just honestly folks in the neighborhood seeing, having something really like a positive narrative to talk about. So now if you visit Salem, there are 75 murals within a 3-block radius, and we've done storytelling and performance art exhibitions and are looking at sculpture for 2021. And all of it is very much done in a way that's connected and embracing the immigrant history of the neighborhood. I would say too, like in the pandemic, like since all our work has continued in the last 6 months, but I would say like from the beginning we'd had a real mix of focusing on opportunities for local artists, but also bringing in some of the best artists in the world. And we made a decision last spring that we would focus all of our resources this year, and while this goes on supporting local artists. So we've had a couple of calls for art this summer that have been a way for us to produce some awesome art, but also to get critically needed funding in the pockets of artists in our community who are trying to survive this.
In your experience, there are community development organizations all across the United States. Is this unique? Are you kind of blazing a new trail?
So there are certainly, there's a conversation in the community development world about how to use the arts. And we definitely follow that to a degree, but in our case, this sort of organically sprouted up in the context of a neighborhood improvement plan. So we've always viewed it somewhat as an experiment, and you know, I'm a housing person, so I see the value of investing in housing is so quantifiable. And personally, I never thought about the arts as really like a major tool in the toolbox, but I now see that the kinds of changes that we've had. I'll share one anecdote that I always remember. Some of those same parents that I mentioned, who were really the ones who are focused on stigma because it affects their children. I was talking to a mother who is a neighbor of mine, who was describing her son's interactions with his friends, and heard her son and his friends talking about their neighborhood with such pride. And he was saying, well, I live in the building with the farmer on it. Do you live in the building with the, you know, with the hummingbird on it? And people are talking about their community in a way that with such pride and with smiles and happiness. And I think, like, as a housing person by background, I'm a convert, and I think I do think the community development field has a lot of room to grow, and thinking about fusing arts in our other work. And I think also that what I've seen so much talking to folks locally and around the country who are working in the arts is that in the arts, I think people really want to have deeper and more meaningful connections with communities that traditionally community development nonprofits have worked in. So I think there's just enormous opportunity in the future for there to be a better fusion there. And certainly we want to be a part of that.
Yeah, well, I think you've established yourself as taking on a national leadership role, so more to come on that. I want to ask Mayor Garcetti about his philosophy around the arts and what they can do for communities. In particular, the concept behind the two Pan-California Pacific Standard Time exhibitions, what they meant not only for collaboration among the museums, but also for the economy and for creating relevance for broader audiences in California. And full disclosure, Bank of America was the sponsor of both of those exhibitions. Mayor Garcetti?
Well, thank you, Rena, and great to be with you and Kasimu and Mickey. What an honor it is to be with you guys today, and also to spend some time thinking about this intersection that usually is segregated away, right, between what is political or policy and what is artistic. You know, I was an artist before I was an elected official, a performing artist. I was a musician and an actor. I thought that's what I'd be doing, and lo and behold, now I get to give speeches. But it was that connection. When I ran for office, I actually talked about being my city's storyteller in chief. And I remember my opponent at the time they sent a mailer out making fun of that. But I stick to that, which is that whether you're an artist or whether you're a political leader, really human life is about telling stories. And to me, the story that is most important when I'm a leader of a city like Los Angeles, and I believe even what Mickey was just talking about, when you're giving people a sense of purpose, it is really the word that I gravitate towards is belonging. How do we give a sense of belonging to communities, to a nation, to global citizens as well? Because you look across the spectrum, whether it's the protests that we saw in the streets this year that were kind of a cry to belong and to have a nation where everybody belongs. And it's a great equalizing word, much better than diversity or inclusion, which implies sometimes a power structure of somebody including you. Belonging is about ownership, about that kid that Mickey was talking about who owns that image and that sense of place and home. So Pacific Standard Time was a hugely ambitious effort in one of the great cultural capitals of the world, Los Angeles, which we think of as a cultural capital because of Hollywood, but it's really one of the top 2-3 art centers, visual art centers now of the world. And we have a very LA structure, which is to say no hierarchy, very horizontal, tons of institutions and community groups and galleries and museums, but they hadn't been knitted together. So the Getty, with its incredible vision and reach, put together these things called Pacific Standard Time. And the idea was to bring together dozens of institutions around a single theme. And this iteration, the latest one in 2017, 2018, was Pacific Standard Time LA/LA. And that was Latin America/Los Angeles. And also, I always thought LA was Latino. I happen to have an Italian last name. My father's side of the family comes from Mexico. I'm proudly Mexican American. My mother's Jewish. I'm, the same mix that Los Angeles is. But at the Latino heritage that I share with so many of my fellow Angelinos really had never been elevated and connected. And, it's confusing to grow up as a Latino American because if you ever go to the home countries, they don't see you as them. Here, mainstream America doesn't see you as part of them. So you exist on the frontier, in the border. And thanks to your sponsorship and others, this amazing gathering really embraced the idea of that border, of being border crossers, of saying we're going to highlight Latin American art, but also Los Angeles, and in particular Latino art in Los Angeles. So there was material benefits. I mean, we had, just to give you an idea, there was 84 museum programs, 70 participating galleries, over 600 public programs. It generated nearly $500 million of economic activity, about $25 million in tax revenue, which didn't hurt. But more than that, it gave people, whether they were visitors who came to Los Angeles to see what LA is today and take something of LA back home, or vice versa, whether it was a native like myself who saw the world come to LA and saw the world come from LA, we began to understand ourselves better. As a city older than Washington, D.C., founded in 1781, a native land, and who was here first before we saw the Spaniards come, and then it became a Mexican city, and then finally an American city, and to embrace that history and that sense of place and purpose. And the last thing I'll say, what was beautiful about it is it could be, I don't agree with this old division of what so-called high art, low art, but an institution like the Getty or the most grassroots community group doing art organizing in some of our lowest income communities were all part of the same standard, Pacific Standard Time, and it allowed them to really have a sense that I belong at the Getty Museum, even if I grew up in the poorest zip code, and vice versa. I might be the wealthiest art collector and coming to Los Angeles, but I belong visiting a neighborhood I've never been into to learn something more about myself and about this moment in history.
Well, that point you made about low art and high art. I mean, today's high art at one point was low art, and that's been the case a lot of times throughout history.
Exactly right.
So just wait just a moment. But the initiative also was not only successful and ambitious, but it's most recently given rise to a new coalition among museums that are focused on Latinx arts. Do you think that this has these kinds of things have a way of driving a new approach to delivering the arts? This idea of collaboration across institutions.
No question. I think there was a lot of suspicion. A lot of folks wondered, would we be subsumed under the big boys and girls? Vice versa. The big boys and girls wondered whether they'd be dragged down by the kind of community art aspects. And everybody came out of this realizing, if you're missing each other, you're missing the picture. And you're never going to build that sense of belonging if you're not everywhere. Our art loves to dabble in community, and community loves to dabble in art. But to fully integrate those two things together is what art is. It's our purpose. I mean, if we want to transform the trauma of this year where we're going through pandemic and economic downturn and finally a shot at birthing a true multiracial democracy in this country, here where the skies are literally full of smoke, and in the South right now where hurricanes are dumping kind of Mother Earth's tears, we have to figure out a way where we break that down. If we're going to have hope societally and socially, I think it can start first with that common recognition of a story that an artist is telling, and her story of communicating that and making us feel something is part of the healing that then allows us to reimagine the future.
Thank you very much. I want to turn to Kasimu. Do you have a view as to whether and how the disruption that we're going through, the emerging approach of collaboration, can be harnessed for more engagement with communities?
Yes, I was actually just in LA, Mayor, and I got a chance to work with a group, No Us Without You. And historically, they're bartenders, or a bar consulting group, who use the global pandemic in their own ingenuity to feed more than 1,000 families a week who have been displaced out of work or no longer able to work from their time in the hospitality industry. So just seeing that is very inspiring to me as it relates to community. And even looking at that poster, the artistic thread through that one of the things that they say is that this is just human to human. Don't look at people as an undocumented worker or not American citizen. Human to human. What do we need to do for each other to survive? And that has stuck with me, and it related back to my work, them being in the traditionally bartenders or bar consultants. And I just thought that was beautiful to see how people galvanized and how organized they were. And you wouldn't typically think that would have been their skill set. And that's going to stay with me for a long time. And I think that art is always responding to some type of upheaval in society. And, it's often said that history is journalism is the first draft of history. Well, I would think that art would be another draft, maybe a slower, more meditative type thought on what's going on in society. And however we can do that to disrupt it. I also often look at art as a Trojan horse, where we may not immediately see the message, because sometimes we can become compassion deficient of things that people may say. But when you see that same narrative from a different point of view, that initially you only thought it to be a beautiful picture or a beautiful portrait, but then when you see the deeper meaning behind it, that's the point of art. And the point of art is not to give answers, but it's to help us ask better questions. So as an artist, I find it my duty to do that. And often within my practice, the ideas come from actually being really upset, whether it has been about schools in New Orleans, because that's a great inequity across America, the haves and the have-nots, basically. And then if you have a poor education, it perpetuates your socioeconomic place in this world. So I did this, I guess you would say it's a constructed reality where everything was staged, but it was based in truth, looking at students who were fighting to have themselves educated. And often within my practice, I started being a photographer in 2015, and that was on the heels of, 2005, so 15 years. That was on the heels of Hurricane Katrina. So when I was dealing with the great devastation with my hometown of New Orleans being destroyed, it was the art that helped to carry me through and to tell stories of the people who I felt, the whole city I felt was often overlooked, because, I went to graduate school for journalism, but oftentimes we have this news cycle and you have to really move on quickly. So for 3 years, I looked at the recovery of the city post-Katrina. So again, that meditative kind of thoughtfulness of it. And it was also through the loss of a lot of the neighborhood bars that I started to do the Vanishing Black Bars, because just really quickly, there's this one stretch of land on St. Bernard Avenue. It's in a historically black neighborhood that really is next to the French Quarter, the 7th Ward in New Orleans. So it's prime real estate. So it kind of touches on what all the panelists have some experience with, whether it be housing, whether it be governance. This area has rapidly changed. So while when I was growing up, they would have 7 to 10 black-owned bars. And one day in, I think 2017 or 18, I just realized that it was only one black-owned bar left. Now the bars are still there, but they've shifted, they've gentrified a little bit. And what happens to the displacement of that culture when the bars are no longer there, where the culture of black masking Indians or second lines can be practiced? So that's what inspired me. So again, in another time of loss and devastation, I'm inspired to just keep telling our own stories as well. And lastly, I look at my work like a Zora Neale Hurston or Alan Lomax, where there were ethnographers and documenting sometimes things that are often overlooked. Because another thing I noticed about the Vanishing Black Bars was that whenever I tried to do research about them, they didn't exist. No one told their story. The only time you would see their name and newsprint is if there was some unfortunate incident or outside of the bar or something like that. So the bar could close as recently as 2 or 3 years ago, and there's no record of it. No one told this story. So that was a great catalyst for me to do what I'm doing now, which I think ties into responding to devastation and also always trying to keep a record of what's happening in the world and particularly in my community.
So in some ways, your art has one foot kind of firmly planted in almost in the idea of journalism, telling those stories and keeping people current on what's happening, what's happened in the past. How do you think, Kasimu? How do we do a better job of making people feel included? That the arts are for everybody. It's a big question, I know.
That's something I think that's a great question. It's something we always try to figure out. I think it starts at a young age, really. And then obviously you build that up of helping people feel included. Let me step back a little bit. I think it's multi-tiered. I think that you should have a board that reflects the community it serves. I think that you should have curators that are from a very inclusive background. And secondly, the art on the walls should also reflect the community. And then I guess most simply, be it the security guard, the greeter, the docents, everyone there should be welcoming to welcome the community in. And then also programming, what type of programming you have to reflect the community. Because, sometimes you have these books like Wine for Dummies or Personal Investing for Dummies. Some people never really experienced art. And I recently wrote a little story about Leah Chase, the chef of Dookie Chase. If you go to Dookie Chase restaurant, she's amassed a beautiful collection of African-American art. Jacob Lawrence, Elizabeth Catlett, Melvin Edwards. She died at 96, but she didn't visit an art museum until she was 54. So it's important for people to be exposed to arts at any age. And because of her exposure to art, she went on to collect this beautiful collection of work. And now when you go to Leah Chase's or Dookie Chase's now, you think you're just going to get some chicken and some gumbo. You're going to see all this beautiful art. So it's these various touch points. So I heard Carrie Mae Weems say once she wants to put art up on the walls and sometimes take it off. So sometimes it's bringing art to where we are as a community. So I think it's important that we have to continue to do all those things and be unwavering in the commitment, because a more inclusive, or like the mayor said, a art environment where more people feel that they belong will result in better arts for everyone.
Right. No, I couldn't agree with you more. Mickey, what do you've been doing a lot of work to try to bring arts to the community, create pride in the community through art. But what is your sense of what can be done better, kind of writ large?
Well, I think similarly, I couldn't agree more with Kasimu's comment that there's many aspects of this. I think one of the things that we've done this year is one of the things we heard really early on during the quarantine was that a lot of the folks that in our community are not getting their news. This is just a micro example, but I think a good one. They're getting their news sources from Dominican satellite TV, and we're not really aware of the public health, the latest and greatest public health information. So we worked with our public art team and did a call for art for public health oriented posters that could be done bilingually and posted throughout the neighborhood and our buildings, but also in like bodega storefronts. And those have been one cool way that I think we've been able to connect those two kind of corners of our organization, our community organizing team and our public art team, so that what we are producing is produced by local artists for really like timely local need. And also I want to say one of the things that's been really nice is we do have a great partnership with the local museum in our city, the Peabody Essex Museum, and they've been good to us as a partner, both with advice from individuals, but also there's one piece of making museums more welcoming for for everyone, right? Which I think is a great long-term goal. But I think one of the ways to achieve that is bringing art into communities that traditionally haven't viewed museums as a destination that's like welcoming for them. And one of the ways that Penn did this was early on in our program. They commissioned a mural on the surface of a small basketball court in a little park that my organization had built. And it's beautiful and cool, and 10-year-old kids, that's their like go-to play spot on that street. But it's also a really important um, like identification of value on their part, that it isn't just about like sponsoring our events. It's about you know having their curator bring an artist in and do an installation in the Point neighborhood. And I think that's I know there are partnerships that are beginning to happen around the country, and I think solidifying those so that they're not one-off things where you can continue to develop programming together. And we're never going to have the high art expertise to the degree those folks do, but I think we can really work together on fusing together our expertise with organizations like PEM and others to to bring high art into communities, and also to challenge museum and cultural institutions to think about the programming that's going on in there, and making it continuously relevant to folks from all backgrounds.
Well, I have to say, in my day job, I work with museums all over the world, and I have to say I've been really impressed by the attempts that the museums are making, not just attempts, but real changes that they're making in terms of what they're offering. I think I remember reading something some years ago in a magazine called Connoisseur, which is now defunct, and it talked about the museum as temple. And I think those days are kind of coming to an end. This idea that you're going into a temple, and you have to kind of speak in hushed tones, and only certain people belong, and there's going to be a certain reverence there. I think the reverence is for the human achievement that you're witnessing. It's not for the institution itself. So hopefully these disruptions and changes that we're going through will continue to push things in that direction, because I very much believe the arts are for everyone, and I agree so much with Kasimu. It's about, as a young person, being exposed, not just drawing in school or anything, things like that, but to think of art as a whole new world. I think is important for young people. So with that note, I do want to switch over to Mayor Garcetti, because he obviously gets it. We're still fighting this whole idea of that arts are a nice thing to have, but they're not, a necessary social need. How do we get the disbelievers out there to think as you do, to understand the arts are a necessary social and economic good, and not just something that's just kind of incidental and nice to have after everything else is taken care of?
Well, I think it has to be a cradle to grave initiative. We have to just teach differently. We have to cross borders, whether they're age or geography. And Kasimu, it was great to hear you. We should have made Pacific Standard Time LA mean Latin America, LA, and Louisiana, because you brought LA to LA. So appreciate you for doing that. And when we cross-fertilize these things, and, we think about, just to your point, that these temple-like museums, when we explode that's when things become alive. I'll give you a couple examples. Our Los Angeles County Museum of Art, most popular places to gather, maybe outside the Hollywood Bowl, and you've got to pay to go there, are Friday nights, which are jazz nights, and Saturday nights, which are Latin music nights, in which there is just 1,000 Angelinos who come together and hang out at the museum. I mean, it's the most beautiful, there's people sitting on the wall at the museum, there's people in the courtyard, and there's not hushed tones. You know how we had, in the midst of this pandemic, early hours for seniors so we could keep them safe in the grocery store? I think we should have a few quiet hours in a museum, but the rest of the time we should make them loud celebratory places. We shouldn't have kids go to a museum for the first time and be told, shh, like they are in a library. It should be the opposite. I'd love to hear a museum full of kids yelling, celebrating, dancing, bring music in there, do things that actually mobilize what art is, and then vice versa, bring that out into the community. So I think it's about educating, and to Kasimu's point about education inequality, there is no equal arts education. I mean, I can brag about LA being arts capital of the world, and yet if you're a black or brown kid growing up in Los Angeles in a low-income neighborhood, you get zero exposure to art, or maybe it's once a month, or it's in a very limited way. It's not integrated in. And in a moment of pain like this, I think we have such opportunities. I mean, when my fellow mayor authorized just the words "Black Lives Matter" on a street in Washington, D.C., and here we had a kind of LGBTQ take on that, which was all Black Lives Matter on Hollywood Boulevard, the most famous street maybe in the world after Champs-Élysées, which we're now going to make permanent. Those become, again, that sense of belonging, and that art doesn't have to exist in a gallery or a museum. It's right there on the street. It's there for a tourist. It's right there for a bartender. It's right there for a worker, a kid going to school. And so it's really about the desegregation of art and the training early on that art isn't something special. Art is a necessity, and it's everywhere around us. You can be a creator and a consumer every moment of the day. And at the most painful moments, if we don't invest in it as a part of our healing and as a part of our kind of moving through trauma to something better, we will be held back, because a year like this is too painful without moments that express who we are. One last thing I'll say, all of our testing centers, we've commissioned a series of murals around all the places where people now go, drive or walk up throughout Los Angeles to get their COVID-19 tests, because we want people to feel something, not just feel the anxiousness of getting a test, not just to feel the pain of maybe the loss that people have experienced, but to crystallize visually, to hit a different part of their brain and their soul. And so long past the pandemic, we have moments to do that all the time. And I think we can lead that sort of democratization of art to make it an everyday thing and not a once in a while thing.
Well, I couldn't agree with you more. I always have to preface what I say around these things is that I'm admittedly biased about the arts and their importance and about their power, but I couldn't agree with you more. I think everyone's life, they tell us about our history, they educate us, they tell us about society, they tell us about philosophy, they tell us about people hurting and basic human feelings and basic needs. And I mean, I don't understand how it's not necessarily thought of as real sustenance in terms of creating those kinds of understandings across cultures, within cultures, cultural understanding, tolerance, all of those things that are so important. They're the best tool out there for doing all of those things, notwithstanding folks like yourself who are government leaders who also are trying to help us deal with all of those things. So I want to thank everybody. This has been great. I've loved talking to all of you. I hope you've enjoyed it, and onward and upward. Let's get through this, and let's use art to get through it. Thank you.
Thank you, Rena. Appreciate you. Kasimu, Mickey, great to be with you.
Thank y'all. Thank y'all. Truly.